How convincing is Greek mimesis, the New Testament imitating Greek literature, Euripides' Bacchae, Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, or even Roman stuff like Virgil's Aeneid? How common was it? Were there Jews that were doing this? Today, academic scholar Michael Kochenash, who was also a student of Dennis MacDonald, tackles this question, and I probe him a little more on why are several scholars reluctant on accepting or seeing this stuff. You get to hear his answer. I hope you enjoy this conversation because Michael Kochenosh has done several amazing episodes. I'll link them in the description with MythVision on the name Aeneas, why this signals Rome, and it's more of a literary product rather than literal historical. Several other things he shows of imitation to Jewish literature and Greek. You won't want to miss it. Dr. Michael Kochenosh, welcome back to MythVision podcast, my friend.
Oh, thank you very much.
I want to talk to you about mimesis criticism. I want to edge our way into it. But before we do, can you tell our audience about your background? What is your expertise? What did you go to school for?
So I was trained in biblical studies. I did my master's at Yale and then a PhD at Claremont School of Theology. My doctoral advisor was Dennis MacDonald. And I'm on my second postdoc after that. So I went to Hunan University in China and did a 2-year postdoc. And I'm now about a year or so into a postdoc at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And I'm focusing my research right now mostly on the way that early Jewish and Christian narratives use literary models, both from the Jewish scriptures and from classical Greek literature, as resources for developing and emphasizing certain themes.
What made you take that path and go to Claremont and dive into the Greek antecedents?
Oh, well, part of it was just what programs I got into. Obviously, that was one that I targeted, mostly on the reputation of Dennis MacDonald. And then I was accepted and he was going to be my advisor. So prior to going to Claremont, I didn't have much of an expertise in classical literature. I think that's an understatement. And so before going to Claremont, I like the summer between getting accepted and going to Claremont, I dedicated myself to reading Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, and then I think I got through a few books of Virgil's Aeneid before classes started in the fall. So that was partly a strategy to make sure I understood what Dennis was talking about when I started taking classes with him. And so from there, it's just been learning more and more about the classical world and the way other writings written at the same time of the New Testament seem to have been written and what they're doing and how they do it.
Were you highly skeptical of his position when you first approached it? Did you see the criticisms against MacDonald's work?
This isn't the answer you're looking for, but no, I wasn't, and I hadn't. My main exposure to Dennis prior to that was at Yale. I took a class on New Testament Apocrypha with Harold Attridge. And one of the assignments everybody had to do in that class was to present a book, like a scholarly book on something from the New Testament Apocrypha. And as it happened, I was assigned, or I picked, I don't remember how it went down, Dennis's book on the Acts of Andrew, so Christianizing Homer. And so I read it and understood it as best I could at that point in my development. And I remember Harry asked after I presented, he's like, so what do you think of Dennis MacDonald's argument? And I remember I said something to the effect of, I'm not very familiar with Homer and the Homeric stories, but it seemed like it made sense. And he said, yeah, that's how a lot of us feel, which maybe is an insight to New Testament studies generally, where people are not very familiar with the Homeric stories. I've become more familiar with the criticisms since being Dennis's student and pursuing a research career of my own.
And have any of those criticisms made you realize that you're just dead wrong about the Greek antecedents?
Not yet. No, it's to be fair to everybody. A lot of this can feel very subjective, and reading is itself a very subjective process. There's no like one audience for any particular work, and so for some readers, allusions to Homer or imitation of Homer might be very clear, and the purpose of it might also be clear, and other readers may not see it at all. And there's a perspective from which, that's fine, and that's the way it is. You would want maybe both sides of the conversation to have that kind of attitude, I think, because sometimes it does get a little bit belligerent toward Dennis, at least. I haven't myself felt as much aggression as he seems to have faced.
Well, you said it yourself. I've interviewed Harold Attridge on his commentary of Hebrews, Hermeneia, and then, of course, we talked about the Gospel of John, who was the beloved disciple. Brilliant mind. But as he echoed, and several other scholars I've interviewed have echoed, there seems to be a lack of understanding or knowledge of Homer. Mm-hmm. They don't know this literature. They're not really aware of the Aeneid. They don't really care to dive into this because it's not part of their requirement. It's not really necessary for what they do in mm-hmm. their mind, which mm-hmm. I think is a blind spot. So let me ask you this. Diving into this, you started to read that material. Did you become fonder of Dennis's mimesis as you really started to learn something that seems to be New Testament scholars are ignoring or aren't really studied up on?
Oh, for sure. And I would say actually maybe what sold me most on it was, and I don't remember if I shared this story on MythVision before, but so for repeat listeners, sorry. One of the first assignments I had with Dennis, it was on like a exegesis graduate seminar, and the book for the class was the Book of Acts. And one of the first assignments was to read through the Book of Acts from start to finish. And I did it, a good student that I was. And when I got to Acts 9, which is where Peter heals a man named Aeneas, I was shocked because I'd never read I'd read Acts, maybe cover to cover, I don't remember, but I had never read the Book of Acts, having read the Aeneid or the Iliad for that matter. And of course, Aeneas is the protagonist of the Aeneid, is a very well-known figure in Antiquity. And so I was shocked to see that name in the Book of Acts. And that experience led to the article I wrote about Aeneas and the connection to Rome that I presented on MythVision last year. Viewers can go back and find that. The more I've learned about Homer, the more I've learned about Euripides, the more I've learned about the way they can be read, that is, the early Jewish and Christian writings can be read in relation to those foundational stories that played such a pivotal role in literary education in Antiquity, the foundation blocks of the encyclical education. And so everybody who learned how to read and write in Greek in the ancient world had at least some exposure to Homer, but there's no evidence for people not having exposure to Homer. So we can say that. It to me just makes sense. It's not that everybody's going to agree every time. Like I've read arguments in favor of, say, the imitation of the Bacchae in the Book of Acts by people other than Dennis, to be clear. And I'm not always convinced, but it's not because I don't think it's a fair strategy for reading the Book of Acts. It's just that the details are not convincing in this or that case.
So diving a little further, I love this. You mentioned you were reading and finding out it wasn't just New Testament text that seemed to imitate. There's text contemporaneous, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, that are around the New Testament. If we imagine kind of an analogy of a bubble, there's several bubbles surrounding the New Testament of literature, and Jewish, like staunch, we know were Jewish authors were imitating Greek antecedents in their writings.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Dennis that did this. Were there other scholars who recognize this, or?
Oh yeah, I mean you see it every now and then in scholarship. say on Judith or on Joseph and Asenath. So you get a French scholar here or an American scholar there, pointing to an echo of the story of Helen, for instance, in Joseph and Asenath, or even echoes of Homer in Judith. So I just recently published an article on Judith and the use of Homer, Homer's Odyssey, but it helps that not only Dennis, but at least one other commentator that I'm blanking on her name, argued for the use of Homer in a different part of Judith. So yeah, you see it every now and then, but there hasn't been like a programmatic emphasis on finding these echoes of Homer. But yeah, you see it in works on scholars working on Josephus, scholars Dennis, and others working on Tobit and other the Maccabees. Yeah, it's there to be seen, but if you're not looking for it, it would be easy to miss it.
Why do you think it is not so popular? It is not well understood. Would you say, and I don't want to feed you the answer, but I imagine what we talked about earlier, they haven't read Homer. They haven't read the Iliad. They haven't read the Aeneid. They're not sure, Virgil's works or whatever it might be. I'm sure that plays a role, but why do you think this Greek antecedent mimesis is not taking off like wildfire, similar to what we see as Jewish antecedents?
Mm-hmm. I think first and foremost, the issue is lack of familiarity with those earlier writings. But that's only the first thing. I think beyond that, there is. So I'll say it this way. So I published an article a year ago on Acts 12, on Rhoda in Acts 12 as a Cassandra figure, which is something that MacDonald has published on in the past. So I conceived of it as building on that. But the way I approached the article, which is a little bit different from Dennis, was to focus on the way that it contributes to the themes of the book of Acts, or at least the greater passage. And I think that's where some people get stuck, is they can see the Dennis laying out the side-by-side parallels and the verbal agreements here and there. But it's not always clear to some readers, at least, why the book of Acts would be imitating Homer or whatever, what have you. And so that's been something that I've tried to really emphasize, is not only to establish that imitation is happening, but also helping readers see why it might be happening, how imitating a story about Homer contributes to the purpose of the book of Acts or the book of Judith or Joseph and Asenath, for example. So
is it fair to say also that maybe the direction of New Testament studies just hasn't taken the Greek world and their writings as serious as they should? For example, M. David Litwa in his beautiful book, Jesus Deus, I loved that book, where he kind of shows that our dichotomy of Jews and Gentiles and Hellenism that's old news. That's hundreds of years old, outdated. Get rid of that notion, the way that we've had it. I mean, Jews were literally sweating Hellenism. It was, you might even have a hard time in the ancient world to know, is this a Jew with a Gentile name? Is this a Gentile now named with a Jewish name? Is this, who's the author? Can we identify them? It's hard to know. They were calling Yahweh and Zeus the same interchangeably in some contexts. So I wonder if there's still this kind of post-World War II, what happened in Nazi Germany, and the way that we are trying to, interfaith dialogue taking place within the New Testament community of scholars to try and make up for what has happened to the Jews, not only then, but also in church history with anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a huge question to ask, and you may not know the answer to, but it's kind of like, I see how they want to really make it so Jewish, and don't get me wrong, it is. But what does that even mean? So what are your thoughts about what I'm saying so far? Is this an issue? Is this Is this a stumbling block for New Testament scholarships on seeing the Greek imitations?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I don't think, in at least in my perception of my colleagues across the guild, I don't think there is a perception that like the Greco-Roman background, if we can call it that, is irrelevant or somehow lesser. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the Greco-Roman background, but it's just conceived of differently than a conception of it that includes Homer and Euripides, for example. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it may be for some. I wouldn't say that it's sort of widespread that people think of the New Testament as Jewish literature, which is a good thing for people to think of it as, because it, the best we can say is Jewish literature. There are people who go from that to the conclusion that, oh, well, Homer is irrelevant. Actually, just a few weeks ago, a colleague of mine posted about a talk he was giving in Paris about Luke and Acts as Jewish writings. And then somebody commented, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have it memorized, but the comment was something like, oh, so these are not indebted to Homer like Dennis R. MacDonald would have us believe. And then I, of course, took that as like catnip to reply, like, well, in fact, the status of these writings as Jewish has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not they imitate Homer, because Jewish writings imitate Homer, right? There's that I think reflects this sort of false dichotomy between the Jewish world and the larger Mediterranean world, which I think there's no evidence for a lived experience that is so bifurcated, so isolated of the Jews as against the rest of the Mediterranean world.
I hope that scholarship continues to progress down the path of actually investigating both worlds. It's almost having one eye closed and only looking at one antecedent, not seeing a bigger context. But I want to take us back to when you said you didn't really know Homer, you didn't really know the Aeneid, you got prepared, you read it, you were looking at Dennis's stuff, it made sense to you, but you really didn't know much. Harry said, Dr. Attridge. Mm-hmm. Then you actually get to know this material. And I would say at this point, you know it pretty well, I would say. I'm sure there are classicists who know it far greater than you. Sure. Right? That's their specialty specifically, right? Mm-hmm. But the question I have now that you know that material, what are some of the arguments or the kind of imitations that you've seen that really early on, kind of like give me your born again experience to becoming a Greek antecedent believer. Okay. What sold you and you went, this is just to me undeniable for my own eyes. I can't unsee this.
Not to disappoint you, I don't think I had like a road to Damascus experience, if I may. One of the early assignments that I worked on with Dennis was so sort of taking your question anyway, was the question of the demoniac in Mark 7, the Gerasene demoniac, and reading that as imitating the Polyphemus story in Homer's Odyssey, which I found very interesting. And as I was looking at it and looking at the reception of the Odyssey in the Aeneid, maybe this is sort of an answer to your question. I saw that the demoniac didn't sort of at the end didn't line up with the Homeric story, but made more sense with, or at least the demoniac's reaction where he begs to go with Jesus. It sounds a lot more like and I'm forgetting the guy's name in the Aeneid, where he asks to go with Aeneas. But then again, you have a contrast where he does go with Aeneas, Odysseus' former comrade. And then in Mark, Jesus instead sends him to tell the people nearby what had happened to him. But that was my first experience, sort of in what you might call like the sandbox of mimesis, of playing around with. Here's a proposal for one text imitating another. What are the ways we can think of how this is a strong argument, and how can it be improved upon, or how can we make sense of it in this ancient context? And so putting it into discourse with other imitations of Homer, closer to the composition of Mark, was one way for me that I think reinforced that this does make sense.
So when we're looking at these imitations, for me, I'm just throwing mine back to get your kind of thoughts. You feel free to comment on. I noticed that Jesus looks like this Elijah figure. He looks like Elijah in Mark. He looks like Moses in Mark. He has a Mount of Transfiguration scene. Mm-hmm. Several things kind of highlighted to me that they're rewriting narratives from the Hebrew Bible. And that was obvious. And I was cool with that, because that was a sacred hill that I could tread upon as a believer even. And even when I kind of started to open my mind from fundamentalism and seeing a bigger world, I felt comfortable and safe. Like, hey, it even signals, it is written, or things like this that are clear allusions. Or when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? We know this is Psalm 22, this cry that we're seeing lifted out of this text to put into the mouth of Jesus. And I stopped thinking, well, that meant that's what Jesus literally actually said necessarily, and started saying, this is a well-crafted story about Jesus by Mark, especially when the secret Messiah motif played a part. I mean, that really started to make me go, you mean to tell me the historical real guy was walking around, nobody really know but the reader? You see, you have an omniscient eye. You get to hear what was said to Jesus alone when he was baptized. Matthew makes it plural where everybody can hear it. But Mark, it's just God, the Father, speaks to him and says, you are my son. Not this is my son. And so I started going, this sounds more like a literary narrative constructed. That was clear. Then when I ran across Dennis, and I wasn't his student, but you could say in a way I kind of am, because I've been listening to him for a while, reading his books and studying online. I started to get like really impressed with some of these connections, because I wasn't really aware of what Hellenism even was. Imitating the Greeks. This was just the way it was. And once I started realizing Hellenism entered the door, not really noticing, not even really thinking of it like this literature, these authors are impacted by what we call Hellenism, or imitating the Greek world, the Greek and Roman world. That's when I started to have a real open mind to this stuff, even though I got a lot of pushback. So let's discuss a little bit of criticisms, if you can. Did you want to comment on that before we get into any?
I kind of did. It reminded me that one thing that Dennis has proposed that I feel like hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, the scrutiny, you could say, is his treatment of the Messianic secret in Mark. And it feels like a very nice solution, right? So this, going back to Wilhelm Wrede, that Jesus keeps his identity as the Messiah secret in Mark's gospel until the end, I suppose. And why does this make sense? And Dennis has said in response to Wrede, well, if this is an imitation of the Odyssey, then it makes sense, because Odysseus did conceal his identity from the suitors and his own family members. So I find it very interesting and compelling, and I just haven't seen anybody engage it, not substantially anyway, or maybe somebody did early on. That so it was about 20 years ago that he wrote about that, I think. Maybe people have not picked it up again, but that's something I would like to see. If I were to start thinking about Mark, I might pursue that further myself. But yeah, speaking of arguments that he's made that just sort of made sense to me, that was an early one.
Same here. I mean, I couldn't deny what Wrede was saying about the secret motif. I didn't know how Odysseus's identity was like hidden by a god, of course, not letting people see who he really was. And then there was little clues along the path, little cookie crumbles that kind of let you know this is the guy. And then some people would get it. And even when he showed them who he was, he's, shh, don't say anything, just like Jesus. So that really made me go, this seems so perfect, hand in glove. How come somebody hasn't already made this and shouted this from the rooftops? It made me think we've been, again, stuck, trapped in this, what we keep coining as Jewish world, as if that means there's also this Greek one that, is like so separate, because I feel like church history and the polemics, you pagan, you're not a Christian, you're an other. And if you're not a Christian, Christians who come out of Judaism would have had nothing to do with that pagan world. That just is false. There's so many reasons to say that's false. We almost imagine the New Testament authors and Paul to be Maccabees. I mean, like we imagine them to be these like total rebellious group. But even then, when you go to rebel and oppose these ideas, you also engage them.
Right. Yeah. The Maccabees are written in Greek and imitate classical Greek literature at times. So that's, it's an interesting example to point to.
Yeah. Even if you were completely opposed, you're still going to see a reflection of having to oppose by opposition. And that is what's interesting about this. So no matter what, I feel like the escape, you're trapped with probably having to deal with it. I've heard of there's several critics, and Dennis is engaged, trying to point out their kind of issues. Margaret Mitchell, I know there's Carl Olof Sandnes. Have you read some of their critiques? And do you have off the top of your mind, like any memory of like some of the flaws you might have seen in what they were saying about Dennis's work?
I have read them, but not recently. But to be honest, I have the memory of reading them, and then reading, Dennis wrote like a short little piece called My Turn, response to the critics of mimesis criticism, and found his response pretty satisfying. But I'm sorry, I don't remember the specific points they make. But in general, I can think of even more recent people writing about Dennis. I mean, there was one in a book that just came out a year ago, maybe. And the author at least was arguing for the use of Homer in the book of Acts, but in a very minimalist sense. But expended a lot of energy to dismiss Dennis's work and to make it clear to readers that he doesn't view Dennis as somebody he wants to be associated with, which I didn't enjoy reading. And I think he made the point, like explicitly said it. I'd have to look it up. He said something to the effect of like, if what Dennis says is true, then like we know nothing about early church history, which feels like, and maybe I'm getting that quote wrong. So sorry, person I won't name for if I misremembered what you said, but it was very clear that he had a motive for opposing Dennis. And this is only one case, but he had a motive for opposing Dennis and made it explicit within the writing itself. I'm not sure how that got through peer review, but it did. And I'm sure there are others for whom they don't say it explicitly. And I do want to say, I think there are plenty of people who take it seriously and just don't find it convincing. I think that's fine. They don't have hidden agendas, I'm sure, just to be clear.
Yeah, I have a hard time knowing why some of this isn't convincing. I mean, I just personally can't see how some of it's not. I mean, it makes very little sense. It's kind of weird, that kind of opposition. I don't want to be associated with him. And why this mentality. Dennis is a stand-up guy, really, really nice person. I don't understand what the problem is. And then they kind of poo-poo his work. And that's why I actually wanted to bring you on here today to get your thoughts. But someone might be watching this saying, yeah, you brought on a student of his. He's just biased. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, that's not a fair reason to dismiss me. But I mean, people are going to make their decisions about who to listen to, and we all have limited resources and energy and time. And so, I would say, first off, repeat what I've said already today. If somebody in the ancient world is writing in Greek, they have exposure to Homer. And so the claim that an ancient text written in Greek imitates Homer or alludes to Homer or refers to Homer is inherently plausible. It doesn't mean it's should be accepted in every case, but it's plausible. But I think that is not something that most people accept. So I think that is demanding something of people that they're not giving already. From there, I mean, there are a lot of cases that show a pretty clear relation of early Jewish and Christian narratives to the Homeric writings and tragedians. And so you can start probably accepting some of those. Like you can look in conservative commentators like F.F. Bruce writing on Acts and saying this word in Acts 27 is Homeric. Now he doesn't say that the shipwreck of Homer is an imitate. Excuse me, the shipwreck of Paul is an imitation of Odysseus' shipwreck. But it opens the door to ask the question. So just because he doesn't mean you shouldn't. And so you can look at those little connections. You can see the use of the word theomakos in Gamaliel's speech in Acts 5, and if you're familiar with the classical world, you know that's distinctively Euripidean and distinctively from the Bacchae. And I think that, again, opens the door to look at the question of, is there more to this connection, or is this just an artifact of language that maybe had its origin in Homer or Euripides and has made its way into the New Testament indirectly, so not a direct connection to Homer. But I don't think people do that. Not that they would have to reach the conclusions I reach, but I would be interested to see somebody who does that, who recognizes that and then doesn't necessarily think there's any connection.
Right. So this is an interesting one. Indirect or cultural, not literary. Mm-hmm. You have M. David Litwa, who thinks that there may be cultural impact, and it's far messier than we may imagine. It's not this genetic literary thing that Dennis is trying to do. Mm-hmm. But I want to give credit and say, okay, he's not denying mimesis. Mm-hmm. He's saying it's operating in a totally different way in his view, just based through culture. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure he has his particular reasons why he takes this position. But I personally would imagine we're dealing with texts that are also literally borrowing and imitating others, meaning Luke and Matthew are copying Mark. They are working in textual tradition. They are purposefully crafting narratives, writing, looking at other texts. He just doesn't think Greek antecedents or Greek impact necessarily is coming from Greek literature. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that assessment? I'm sure you probably read more about it in the past, but you're more on the direct side rather than the indirect.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't set them in opposition. But to the extent that it's not a focus of my research, yes, my research focuses more on what I think are direct impacts of classical literature as opposed to the indirect. And Litwa focuses on indirect as opposed to direct. But honestly, so he was not the person I was talking about earlier. But he does in his book on what was it? Great title, How the Gospels Became History. I think that's what it is. He does go off on a few pages to very explicitly disassociate himself from the work of Dennis. Almost, I suspect it's more of a signal to who he thinks are his colleagues, his network of colleagues. Like, this sounds like Dennis, but trust me, it's not like Dennis. Maybe that's a charitable reading on my part, but I found it befuddling because it's completely unnecessary. You can talk about the indirect impact of Greek stories at the same time as you talk about the direct. So you don't have to argue against one to argue for the other. And in that book, he does talk about, for instance, the direct use of the Jewish scriptures in, I think, Luke, which is, again, like you can have imitation happening alongside recycling cultural motifs that have their origin in ancient literature. So I found it mostly confusing when I read that book. You'd have to ask him why he wanted to dissociate himself from Dennis's work.
Yeah, maybe I can sometime. Now I'm going to ask you something. Now, I hope this is not too sore of a topic to discuss, but I think it's worth noting. There have been several wonderful scholars, including yourself, that have come out of Claremont under the work of Dennis, learning under him as students, who haven't been able to get jobs. You've worked your butt off. I love learning from you. You've done an excellent show with us. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, Better Call Saul Paul, showing the imitation of what's going on with King Saul and King David, or what was David at the time, who was prophesied to become king, but he pretty much imitates that, and how this also imitates Euripides Bacchae. We talk about the name Aeneas and diving in, how Pervo kind of glanced over it, didn't really dive deep into this, and how it would have registered. Like, we say Michael Jordan, we think basketball, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, you think of bodybuilding, you're going to automatically think Aeneas, Rome. And that was a wonderful episode. We've done some great stuff, so I hope they can check that out. But you've been trying to get employment, at least from what I understand. The same happened to Richard C. Miller, where he wasn't picked up. Like, jobs are not easy to get for you. And you hear over and over, I've heard several times in this episode, where scholars are kind of like distancing themselves from Dennis. Why are they distancing themselves from Dennis, in your opinion, based on what you might know? And then also, what's the struggle with finding work? Is this because of this whole blackballing Dennis, do you think?
So I want to just to say clearly that I don't think it's completely widespread that people don't like or respect Dennis. I've met so many people who have only the highest respect for Dennis. I say I studied with Dennis, and they're impressed by that, even within the guild. He is a very, very well-known, widely respected. It may be that there are some people who dislike him personally. I can't speak to that, but I don't think that is particularly widespread. But yeah, no, I've been looking for permanent employment for a few years now. I've been fortunate enough to be on my second postdoc, and this one in a good location that pays pretty well, and I'm well liked by my colleagues, and they appreciate my research. For Richard and for me looking for tenure track jobs, I don't know what can be said. There are so many different factors involved with every search, and to be honest, the jobs for people with New Testament PhDs, if you're not, so there are maybe sometimes a lot of jobs, but each one, how can I say this? There aren't a lot of jobs most years. So I've been on the market for about 6 or 7 years. Maybe half or a third to a half of the jobs are like confessionally specific. Like you have to be a practicing or a regular attender of this specific kind of church, or you have to be able to sign this specific statement of faith. And so, or Catholics are preferred, or what have you. And so that really cuts down on the number of jobs that are left for everybody else. I don't have the access to the information about placement rates at peer schools to Claremont, or even higher up schools. My sense is that everybody is struggling. And a lot of people are dropping out of academia because they can't even get postdocs that keep them in the application pool for several years. So I'm reluctant to assign the blame to my association with Dennis. To get that answer, you'd have to ask the members of the search committees, and there have been a lot. There was maybe one. I remember there was one job interview I had where I got the impression that someone on the search committee had something against Dennis, but that was only one. That was the only time that's happened for me. I think it's mostly attributable to the poor job market and the state of higher education, especially in the United States, where funding is being chipped away, especially for the humanities, and programs are closing, and people retire, and then they don't replace that faculty line. They just hire adjuncts or nobody. So it's just a sad state of affairs in academia. And no, I wouldn't assign it the blame to my association with Dennis. I could be wrong, but I would need to hear it from a lot of the job committees specifically for me to believe that's the case.
Makes sense. And I'd want the same evidence as well. Why do you think classicists who specialized on Homer or Greek Roman literature have a distaste for this imitation stuff? I've heard through the grapevine they're not a big fan of New Testament scholars or New Testament. Well, obviously, they don't seem to have a high view often of New Testament scholarship, but they're also not seemingly convinced of what Dennis is doing in many ways. Why do you think that is?
I without knowing the specifics of the people you're talking about, I suspect it's just the result of a socialization in academia where for a long time there was a distinction between classics and the New Testament. And the caliber of writing in the New Testament is, I think, by all accounts, inferior to a lot of writing styles outside of the New Testament. And so there might be a socialized way of thinking about people who specialize on the sort of more simple Greek writing, that it's not as worthy of their attention as people who focus on higher literature like Plutarch or what have you. But yeah, I think there's a lot of classical literature that fits in quite nicely with what Dennis has done. And I haven't looked into how well he's received by people who study ancient novels, for instance, or other more novelistic writings. But you'd think that they would find it to be enlightening and edifying for their own work. But no, I can't speak to whether or not they have had access to it. There's so much being published, you can't read everything, and so I'm reluctant to blame anybody for not reading anything in particular. But I at the same time would be convinced that they'd find it helpful if they did make time for it.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you're still publishing, writing things, you're still active, and you gave us the time. So I want to end on this one, and that is, what are you working on now?
Well, I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on right now, 2 or 3. I'm working on a paper that might be part of a larger book that will discuss Luke and Acts, along with Josephus and Homer, and sort of that triangulation of those writers and writings. I'm working on a monograph on the Book of Acts and the way that it uses literary models to advance its themes related to the inclusion of Jews and, non-Jews. And I'm also always working on articles related to the use of literary models in early Jewish and Christian narratives. I'm hoping that will maybe build into sort of a larger book that might introduce the topic of the use of literary models in early Jewish and Christian narratives. So all of those are sort of on the stovetop on different burners, and I'm trying to just make sure I am productive on something at any given moment.
I love that. I can't wait to see what you put out there. You've written some really good stuff. You have a wonderful fascination for Acts. Do you ever see yourself writing a commentary, or are you planning on making like a book specifically addressing literary imitations in Acts or anything like that?
Well, one of those is, so you mean like in a systematic way? Nothing is in my immediate plans. I think I would need to secure longer term employment before I could think so grandly, like a commentary or something that covers the entire book of Acts and its use of literary models. Maybe someday, but not yet. And I mean, for someone looking for that, Dennis has written so much, and it surely would be the first resource that I turn to as I think about that. Sure. I mean, the Pervo is the best commentary on Acts, in my opinion, but it could be updated in a lot of ways, not least because of his personal failings. But he doesn't seem to think of Acts as a work of Jewish literature. He doesn't really do much with the use of literary models, Euripides and Homer, and so I think there's a lot that could be advanced over what he does. Not that I'm the one to do it. I'd prefer someone else to do it, but maybe they could be. I could be involved as a conversation partner in the footnotes if they wanted to use my works.
Thank you so much for your time, Michael Kochenosh. I really appreciate it. Any final words from you?
No, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun talking.
Thank you. Everybody, thank you for supporting. Hit the like button, share this content out, and never forget, we are MythVision.